All right. Today I'm going to do a lecture on Insane in the Endgame, and I like to focus on a couple really complicated endgames that I saw played um, by some of the top players, like really complex. And I want to kind of illustrate how you break them down to understand them, because trying to play a really complicated endgame without being able to simplify it, without being able to, figure out what's going on more simply, is just really hard, because it can be overwhelming to figure out everything. But you have to be able to, first of all, you have to have some basic knowledge a lot of the time. You have to calculate quite a bit. But a lot of it also comes down to just kind of breaking it down into bite-sized pieces and then figuring out what you have to do. So let's start with that. So we're gonna start with this game. This is from Anish Giri against Ian Nepomniachtchi at the Candidates tournament, which started this year. For those of you who know, obviously it got halted, so who knows what's gonna even happen to it, when it's gonna get resumed, if it is. So, but in any case, we're going to check this out and see what's going on. So again, this position's kind of an interesting one. This one's actually white to play, so it's Anish to play, and he has to make the decision of what the best decision is. And first of all, can he take the pawn on c4? So I'm going to give you guys a couple minutes. I'm watching the YouTube chat right now, so hello everyone. And if you have some suggestions, feel free to say them in the chat, or if you have particular questions about the position as well. But in this case, we're actually discovering whether white should play bishop takes c4, whether that's a good move, and if it isn't, then maybe an alternative that would be decent for white. So the target audience, like, I'm not really targeting a very specific rating range, but I would say this is definitely a more advanced lecture. At least, like, what we're going over is extremely complicated. I'm gonna try to break it down. So I don't want to say that if you're a beginning player you can't watch or anything like that, but I would say it's definitely targeted more towards advanced players. So if you think bishop takes c4 is a good move, that's quite reasonable, but you have to ask yourself, like, is there just no problem with it? Is it just a free pawn? Because obviously white would love to take this pawn. The question is whether black has any resources after you do. No problem, Cesar. So what do you guys think? After bishop takes c4, what could happen, right? Like, well, it looks at first like very safe, right? Because if takes, of course, you could take with the queen or rook. You can only be better there with the outside pass pawn, probably. And if I don't take, you're threatening bishop takes, bishop check. So I don't have time for a move like rook c8, because you simply take the bishop with check. So keep in mind, we're looking at it from black's point of view. So this is c4, not f4, and this is c8, not f1. But yeah, it looks like it's just a very safe move, right? But it turns out there's actually something very dangerous for black after you take. So probably, believe it or not here, white should probably play something like rook h4, just improving the rook. So you're kind of keeping an eye on this pawn. Maybe you're going to try pushing your a pawn to try to distract. I would say that black's maybe a bit better, like after a move like rook c8, just trying to put pieces behind and support this pawn. But it's still a very complicated position. I would say that this is not by any means easy to win. The queen's hard to dislodge, and the black king's always open. But white did in fact take the pawn. But the question is, what did Nepomniachtchi as black have in store? What was his plan? Because it looks at first like this is a completely safe pawn to take. But what is black's plan here? Okay, so you guys are getting it. The idea is that rather than play bishop takes bishop first, you start with king g7. And this is a really cool move because you're getting out of the pin, but also somehow white has problems breaking this pin. It looks like white has a whole move to break the pin, right? And then, you know, it should be just good, right? Like if you could just play queen b3, queen b4, you break the pin, life is good. But it turns out it's actually extremely difficult to do so. First, and of course you have to try, right? If you allow this and takes, you're just going to be lost. So in the game, queen b3 was played, which is one of the two reasonable options. But the other one was queen b4. And I realize we haven't, this is almost more of a middle game than an end game so far, but I kind of want to show how the end game was reached because it was really fascinating, this whole phase of the game. And I feel like just because it's an end game class doesn't mean I have to stick to it, but it's insane. So it takes one of the titles. It's insane even if it's not quite an end game yet. So rook b8 is definitely the most logical choice. And then this is the problem. The queen somehow doesn't have any squares. Like it can try to go to a4, but then you have all sorts of issues involving rook check and then going after this rook. It's not queen with queen c6, of course, but like all of a sudden you just get like viciously attacked. Like you can check, you can play here, you have bishop f5 type moves. All of a sudden you're just getting wrecked, right? So the only real try here is actually to play this. And then here the question is how to proceed now, because this is actually a surprisingly annoying move. You're blocking the rook from coming in, and you're ready to support the bishop with this pawn. You've seen this pitch? I may have given a lecture on this before, but it was probably like I don't remember it honestly. When you give lots of lectures, you end up recycling some material. But I definitely don't give the exact same lecture almost ever, so it's usually like I probably gave it about a specific position in this game. But yeah, I mean, when you give lots of lectures, almost everyone recycles at least a little bit of material. But anyway, bishop b5. So the question is what to do with black here. Bishop takes a2, by the way, is not a terrible move here. But it's one pawn, right? And then after that, white maybe has the opportunity to regroup a little bit. So the question is, can we do something more forceful here? Queen b7 is not exactly a fork because this is defended, right? So I do have the opportunity maybe to play a4 and try to defend if you try that. So you have to be a little bit careful about that. And again, I'm seeing lots of individual moves. Bishop d7, queen c1, rook c8, right? But it's better if I see an idea that you have or maybe a whole variation. I had this problem when I was doing a lecture today. I was teaching a group of kids on Zoom, and it was every time I would ask for a variation, I'd see like a bunch of single moves in the chat. And it's like, you know, an individual move is nice, right? But in most positions, you want to plan it out. Like this is not like queen b7 and white resigns, right? So you want to have a deeper idea. You want to look farther ahead in the position. So it's nice when I see things like rook c8 with some bishop h3 idea, something like that. But rook h3, like I think that white just has too many possible responses. You want to look for your more forcing moves first, right? If you give white an opportunity to do this, it's going to be very, very difficult to actually give checkmate. So like if rook c8 here, for instance, and we play maybe even rook e1 at first, or even just this move with the idea of this, I think checkmate's going to be very difficult. So I see a suggestion with this, but keep in mind I can block with the rook, right? Blocking with the rook's not illegal and might be a decent choice, no? Also keep in mind that if you leave with the queen, I have this check, which might prove to be very, very nasty. So you have to be a little bit careful here. Yeah, this is very complicated, by the way. You might need a little extra time. Like this is, as I said, this is a really complicated game. And again, it's a difficult thing, even for like strong grandmasters to figure out. So it's not about whether we can figure out everything. It's just about challenging ourselves to discover these moves. Because again, like when I followed this game live, I was trying to figure all this out, and it was so complicated. And even analyzing the game afterwards and spending time at the board, like it was very difficult. But the key is more to challenge ourselves to come up with good ideas and maybe come up with some good lines, see what we can do. Yeah, I mean, rook takes b5, queen takes b5, everything's on light squares, but you still need a follow-up, right? You still need a tactic. And the fact is that after takes, I still have my king to go to g2 if you try to check me. It's hard to get this pin in with the rook queen covering, so it's just very difficult. But I would say that the key is move order. So Deutsche Valuations kind of has an idea with this, and then trying to take. But the problem is if you try that, the bishop's not supported on d3. So even if I move backwards, rook takes b5 doesn't really work. Not to mention, I think I can play here, and then I cover this key square. So that's going to make your life at least a little bit harder. If you try to attack my bishop, I can always defend with a4. At the very least, I don't see the win there. So you have you're very close to the correct idea. So you have this followed by rook takes b5 and queen c1, but the problem is after check here, my king can escape, right? So if you try to do something like this, you don't actually have a follow-up, and now your own king's going to get attacked and you're down an exchange. So once again, guys, this is really complicated stuff. Let's see what we can do. So queen b7 was mentioned, but the problem generally is this move a4 comes into play, which is just a really, really nasty move. And guys, just to keep in mind, like, I definitely like full suggestions, meaning variations and different ideas. But again, this is complicated stuff. You don't want to feel like, all right, well, I might be wrong with my variation. I shouldn't suggest it. I kind of end up saying this most lectures, but it's like, I'm wrong all the time, and most players are as well. But oftentimes you can learn a lot when you suggest a line, even if it's incorrect. So f5's been mentioned, but this is also a very loose move. And as we've discussed, the rook doesn't mind going backwards. The rook on e1 is actually quite solid, and then a4 comes. And again, once you're solid, you're correct though. I can't go back, right? Because of this. This is true. So after f5, I'd need another move. Maybe I have to go to h4. Yeah, I'm glad I caught myself there. That would have been embarrassing. But yeah, I think I go to h4, and somehow my rook on h4 might be better than on e4. Because again, I can still do this. I don't think you checkmate me here if you try to give checks. Definitely very scary though. F5 is definitely a scary idea. Maybe if f5 I block this way actually. This might be it, because now if rook takes b5, like I block your check. So this might actually be a little safer, come to think of it. But again, lots of really dangerous ideas. Ooh, even here there's this. Oops, sorry. Even here there's this move, right? Threatening this and this. Maybe this is also bad. Yeah, this doesn't look good. Yeah, I have to be careful. There's still this, and then if takes, there's checks, but I don't know if I'm actually gonna give perpetual there. I might, like, here takes check. I'm not sure. If here, then check. Probably you escape though. I think because you have extra material, you should be able to run like this. So this probably also doesn't work. Maybe you have to go here then, just to cover this mate, and to cover this square as well. But yeah, f5 is also a very, very dangerous move. So that's a good suggestion. The queen can fork with the rook and give check on e7. So you want to play here and then e4 for black. So you're cutting off communication and doing this. The problem is, yeah, the queen can give a check here, for example, and that might, you know, make your plans not so great. There's also moves like a4, of course. But again, guys, this is really complicated. The correct idea is actually bishop d5. And again, this is something I checked later, but as you can see, it's not like I can work out all the variations. It's very complicated. So like f5, for example, was not a move that I had looked at, and it looks at least very dangerous to me. Although rook h4, maybe it doesn't work. But apparently this is the correct idea. So the main idea, of course, is if rook e1, you simply grab this bishop with the idea of this check. So white has to play rook e2 here. And then here, there's a really remarkable idea to try to win this game. It's actually really something. Yeah, and bishop d7, by the way, Soviet dog, is almost always runs into a4, and I don't mind this exchange, really. A4 is one of those moves that you really want to prevent unless you have a specific counter to it, because a4 really solidifies white's position. So queen b7 is definitely the start. But the question is what happens now. White probably has to give this check to try to get counterplay. And here you can go to h8, you can go to f8. It's actually very, very complicated. F8's the simpler one, though. And now you have a couple ideas. So white can try to attack the f pawn, but you have a really, really cool idea against this move. King h8 actually, then queen f5 might be the best defense trying to take here. But in this particular position, you have a really, really cool move that actually ends the game almost immediately. This is like very unexpected. Queen c1, queen h6 instead of queen b7. Queen c1, queen h6. But again, I think you're allowing this check. It at least looks dangerous. Like, this looks pretty dangerous to me. So, I mean, obviously allowing that would be tough, but maybe I can play here guarding this. To me, this doesn't look that clear. So queen b7, I believe, is the better move. And then after queen g4, king f8. So a4 is kind of the best try, but queen f5, there's kind of a cool refutation too. I want to give you guys the chance to find it. Bishop g2 and queen f3, but I don't know if you want to trade queens, actually. I think that then the a pawn becomes a little bit stronger. And my rook can run here, so you don't actually win any material. Very nice, Great Wolf. Bishop f7. And Anvimi also found it. Yeah. This is quite a move because it basically stops this from being check. And the idea is that you're having a really nasty double attack. So this is just super, super strong. Kind of a cool little thing. So a4 is a better defense. And now, what is the idea? So bishop f3 is actually okay as an idea, but you actually have a more clever way to do it, which is by playing bishop c4. So you're threatening mate and you're threatening the rook. This is kind of a really cool tactic. But the idea is that because you're threatening this mate, white has to play a more passive move. If you play a move like this, it's playable, but then you have to deal with queen e6. You have to deal with queen here. There are all these active moves that white can try. Whereas after this, white has to play a more passive move, like for example king g1, and then you take the rook. So you kind of get a better version by doing it this way first. But bishop c4 is kind of a cool move, right? So you're threatening the rook and you're taking advantage of the fact that this is a mate threat. So very cool. But anyway, I just wanted to show these variations because to me they were really fascinating. But as you can tell, they're so complicated. So for even a very strong people like Nepomniachtchi and Giri, to find them is very, very difficult. I'm curious how much of them they saw. And the funny thing is, after bishop c4, it's not like the end of the game. It's just you win an exchange and then the game continues. But probably it should be a technical win up the exchange. So in the game, queen b3 was played. Rook b8 happened anyway. And Giri decided to sacrifice to the queen for a rook and bishop. And this is a very, very common technique in order to try to get a draw by a fortress. And fortresses are a very, very complex thing. So this is what happened in the game. He threw in his check. And then took first. I should mention that after check here, this is actually very important. Taking this queen does not work because you have this check and then taking the rook. So there was no attempt like that, so he simply took. And yeah, I mean, you have these fortresses, and it's essentially an attempt to draw the game by basically creating a barrier your opponent can't cross, or creating a position where they simply have no winning ideas. But I would say fortresses are one of the most complicated things. It's funny, Magnus Carlsen had a quote where he said, "I don't believe in fortresses," which is obviously facetious because fortresses exist and he knows it. But it's more kind of a comment that fortresses are so difficult that if you have a lot of material on the board, to actually create a fortress is so tricky. Someone's asking if I would have played something like this myself. I would say that my judgment call here would be that a fortress would be extremely difficult, so I would look to avoid it. But I also thought that after rook b8, I don't think white has better. So I think that this is actually a really interesting drawing attempt because you're so close to having a fortress. But I'm not quite sure you do, and the way Nepomniachtchi played this position was absolutely incredible. It's one of those things where you look at it afterwards, you even look at it with table base a little bit, but mostly I just analyzed it on my own. But even when you look at it with table base, it's amazing accuracy, and he never spoiled the win, which is quite incredible in a position like this. But I would say that this is still very close to the draw. The a-pawn matters a little in that it creates a secure square for the bishop, but overall, it's just very hard when you're just left with queen and pawns on the same side to win against the rook and piece, because the rook and piece cover so many squares. Even if you're up a pawn, oftentimes you just can't win. And again, like, you can't really blame Giri for going for this, right? Like, he's trying to survive, he's trying to defend, he's had a bad position. But I would say that he, I don't know how optimistic he was about drawing this position, but I would say that it's a very difficult draw. But the key question here is, what is black's plan? When you have a position like this where you're trying to crack a fortress, it's really important to have a plan. Now, sometimes you can probe, meaning that you kind of make little threats, you kind of see what your opponent's up to. You don't have to be in a rush. I like this kind of way of playing. But I would say to crack a fortress, you need a plan. So what I want to ask you guys here, and I'll give you a minute or two because it's a complicated position. What is your plan for cracking this fortress? First of all, how is white going to set up this barrier, number one? And number two, what is the plan for cracking this fortress? I think it's extremely important to have a plan. Now, you might have to change your plan. You might have to alter what you want to do later based on what your opponent does. But you definitely need a plan in order to win this game. So take your time and try to find a nice plan for black. That's interesting, NBM. Yeah, I mean, I'm not sure. I'm not sure I remember it, but I'm sure I've seen the game. The Armageddon. Yeah, the Armageddon, though, was a very simple fortress that he created, right? With the rook moving back and forth. Like, even without the bishop, it would have been a fortress. So that was a very simple one. Or without a bishop, it would have been close to a fortress at the very least. So getting the king off the 8th is not a plan, but I would say it's a good idea, right? Like, you don't want this king on the 8th. You want to move it up the board somehow. But yeah, white has everything protected. It's not an easy thing. So you definitely want to activate the black king. That's part of it. But what is your plan as far as cracking the fortress? That's a little deeper, right? You definitely want to use the pawns to shield from the rook checks. It's hard for the rook to give checks indefinitely, though, especially with this many pawns. And the rook only has a few squares that are always safe. It's different if the rook has like a whole sheath of squares where it can never be attacked or something like that. Then it can be really nasty, but at least at the moment, the queen can guard enough squares that you shouldn't be able to perpetuate with the rook. I agree with Soviet Dog's plan, though. You want to use your pawns to crack at white's pawns. Now, you have to be careful. The more pawns you exchange, the closer you get to a position which is probably drawn. But you're going to need to use your pawns to get rid of these. With white has these pawns, the king is so safe. And believe it or not, even though you just have a queen, you're actually playing for an attack or a checkmate. Now, you're not necessarily trying to mate. You're trying to create mating threats or create severe threats so that your opponent has to pitch material. But the main idea, I think, in this position is you want to move your pawns up the board and be able to crack at your opponents. To crack at your opponent's pawns. You also have to move the king up. And again, in most of these positions, not being in a rush is very important, especially if your opponent has no real plan. The key when you're facing a fortress is you want to think about patience, because they're not really doing anything, right? They're just sitting. So it means that you want to improve your pieces to the absolute max before you try to do anything. There are times when they have to set up their fortress, so you have to actually beat them to it. But for the most part, when they set up a fortress or try to, they're not doing anything. They're just sitting. So you want to improve every single one of your pieces before you try to crack at it. And that's kind of a good rule of thumb to follow, right? Because you have all the time in the world to improve your pieces. If you try to do something before doing that, you're going to run into trouble. So let's see what he did. He played queen c1 check, threw a check on c6. And again, this part I'm skipping over a little just because, not to skip over it, but more that black has several options on how to push and how to check. There isn't just one good option. But I would say that he puts the queen here on purpose to make sure this bishop doesn't have a chance maybe to improve itself at some point. He wants to make sure the bishop kind of stays here. It looks nice, but it's also not doing a whole lot. So he wants to make sure the bishop can't reposition itself. So king goes back. Also, he's controlling this diagonal, which sometimes is important as well. And now he plays h5. So he calculates that these checks don't really lead anywhere. White plays them anyway, because there isn't much else to do. And then tries to attack this pawn. So black plays queen f3 to defend it. Rook h8. And then this is a really important moment, because it kind of defines like how the game gets played from now on. So what does black do now? How does black make progress from here? White's basically putting the rook here to make sure you're not going to open up my king with the move h4. So this is quite normal for Anish, to try to prevent this idea. So the question is, what can Nepomniachtchi do as black? So I see e4, I see f5 and e4. You have to be careful about moves like f5. And the reason I say that is because then your king is a little bit more exposed. So if I start kind of, going here, say king here, maybe even this, and I start checking your king might have to go to some unpleasant square to avoid checks. And you want to be careful of that. So I'm not saying f5 is a poor move, but I'm saying that you have to be very, very careful with moves like this. If you play f5 at the wrong moment, it can be very, very bad for your king. So a lot of you are suggesting e4, and that's a very, very logical suggestion. But the key is, what is the variation after e4? What is white going to do? Indeed it is, David. Indeed it is. This endgame was incredibly complicated. So after e4 rook here, I agree with you. I think the move h4 would be excellent. This is one of the main breaks you want to try to get in, because after pawn takes, then all of a sudden you have two pawns running up the board, and those will be very dangerous to white's king. Again, keep in mind, the main thing is you want to be able to threaten white's king. If you can make white's king feel uncomfortable, that's when you're going to be able to make progress or force white to pitch more material. Nepo did win this eventually. Yes, that is correct. For those of you very savvy, you can see the little 1 and the little 0. And again, I didn't mean to relieve any suspense for you guys. But again, I mean, mainly this is about the analysis, right? We're not like, who's going to win? But yeah, rook d8 and bishop d1, exactly Deutsche evaluations. So after e4, rook d8 check, king e7, you still have the move bishop d1. And this is a really, really clever defense. So the question is, what does black do now? Thank you, Muammar. Sorry about the pronunciation. So f5 is not a great suggestion here because your queen is hanging. I assume you meant at a later point. Queen a3 is possible, but typically you want to be able to control more central squares. Like this pawn is not necessarily the most important part of the position here. The king side is really where the battle is going to be won or lost. This is one of those things that happens in like fortress type positions or endgames. You find that outside pawns, they often don't matter as much as they do in other situations, because the pawn can never really move. You're just going to take it. So the pawn is actually not the most relevant part of the position. You want to be more centralized. So queen f5 is possible, but it's also a little awkward, right? So after a move like this, for instance, maybe even rook d2 is possible, with the idea that on e3 we have this. And again, it's just a little bit annoying, right? Like our queen, it feels like it's in the way here. So very good chess king, queen c3. So the queen here is pretty nice because it prevents the rook from retreating to these squares. It threatens queen e1 check, so the rook can't go here. So it pretty much forces white's reply of rook d4, rook d5. And I'm sure if you've seen any of my lectures, and probably on most people's lectures, you talk about how forcing moves are very important. In the endgame, sometimes they're less important, but I would say they still have a degree of importance. And one of the crucial things is that you always look for your most forcing move. And queen c3 was extremely forcing because it takes away these squares and threatens the check, so it forces white's reply. White only has one reply. And oftentimes that means that this move should be examined right away. But he had a planned follow-up. He didn't just do this and then rook d5 and was like, now what? What was his plan? That was the key. All of my lectures. Wow, that's quite a few at this point. I've been giving chess lectures for, oh my goodness, too many years. All right. Queen a1 is possible, but it doesn't really... Keep in mind, you're trying to go after this pawn, but I don't care about that pawn that much. So if you play here, I don't want to say I don't care about it at all, but it's not really the most important part of the position in my mind. So here, I could think about rook d2, but even a move like king g2 I would think about, with the idea that on queen takes pawn, I go here. And you're kind of reducing too much material. An example of something that could happen would be if you try e3, which looks very strong. I play rook f5, and somehow you might actually have a problem here, because if you play e2, I'll simply grab that guy, put my rook here, and this is an example of a position which is a fortress, because my rook can move back and forth, my king can move back and forth all day. You simply cannot run me out of moves here, and the king cannot progress past this rank, past the fifth. So you see how even though you've won a piece, you still can't win because of the idea of a fortress. So this is actually an example of how things can go wrong for you, because that looks so promising once you play e3, but at least from what I've seen, as long as white achieves this, you actually can't win. So that's why these positions are so complicated. But I'd say that you should lean towards playing more centrally or playing more particularly against white's king. This pawn, or going after this pawn, is just not worth the tempo it costs. This pawn does not play a big role, whereas the white king, the discoordination of white's pieces. Remember how I said patience was super important in fortresses? When you have your opponent's pieces on bad squares, when their king's not on the perfect square, the king would like to maybe move up, that's when you actually should be less patient. That's when you should think about striking. e3 here is definitely a move, but you have to be very careful. You're leaving yourself with these two pawns. So after pawn takes pawn, I'm curious what your plan is here. Because if you take on e3 with check, I'll go king g2. If queen e4, I have this move. I'm not exactly sure you're doing yourself a service here, because we're reducing material by quite a bit and getting much closer to a fortress. So I'm not so sure that e3 is actually the idea you're looking for. Keep in mind, guys, the more pawns you trade, the closer you get to a fortress position. Do engines believe in fortresses? Engines have a lot of trouble with fortresses, more than human beings, which is kind of hysterical, honestly. There are certain positions where a human can assess it as a draw much faster than a computer can. So I see a lot of you suggesting h4, which I do believe was played in the game and is an excellent move. But what is his idea after g takes h4? That is the key that you guys have to figure out. So you've already exposed the king a little bit. Why would he sack this pawn, right? Remember the ideas I've talked about? So queen h3 is interesting. Kind of curious how this would go. Queen h3. The only thing is I'm not so sure you actually have a threat. Like is e3 a threat? I think I could still take that. Kind of curious. Like I wonder what happens if I just play something obnoxious like here. You could play e3, but again, I don't know that you have a threat. And oh, I have this. No, I don't have that. Sorry. What can I do here actually? Because the problem is you're just trading too many things, right? As long as you don't win my rook by force, like after takes, like you better have a way to win my rook by force here, because otherwise you're just giving away all your pawns, right? So I don't see it though. If you take, then I go here and I have this block again, right? If you play here, I go here. I don't see it. Maybe you do have a way to win my rook by force, right? But I just don't. You can play this check, but I think I can go back, right? And you haven't actually achieved anything. And otherwise, you don't have any checks. So if I get to safety, you could take this pawn, but then maybe I just go here again and put my bishop here. And again, even though you have a passed pawn, you're gonna find winning this to be near impossible because material's too reduced, right? Like there are so many positions where I can just create a fortress against the one pawn. So I would say that this is not the best approach as far as trying to win. But queen h3 is definitely a very scary looking move, so I can see why you guys were enticed by it. But I would say that because the bishop controls this square, you're not really doing that much with the move. Aha, so we have a suggestion for f5. This is indeed the correct move. So the idea of f5, of course, is that we want to push our pawns. So let's say white plays something like this. Now we play queen g7 check, for instance, queen f6, and we continue pushing. And this position is just almost impossible for white to try to defend. For example, let's say they play rook g5, trying to defend some squares. This is very reasonable. How do we win now? Yeah, I don't know. The Anish drawing thing almost is outdated at this point. I mean, he definitely, I would say, like, if anything, he has somewhat safe tendencies sometimes, but it's like, I don't know. I feel like there are other players who are almost more drawers than him, and I don't know. But he is a good defender, if that's what you mean. Like, he's an excellent defender, so to be able to outplay him and break his defenses is not an easy thing. It seems like Nepomniachtchi does very well against him, though. So a lot of you guys are suggesting f3. That's a nice move. But the question is, how do you finish the game? So for example, let's say I play king g1. What do you do now? Queen f4 I see a lot of suggestions for. So queen f4, maybe this works as well. Because you don't necessarily, well, these pawns are just so powerful that probably you can just do this and try to take the pawn. I kind of like this move. Queen a1 I think is actually also quite strong. Because if rook here, you could simply take this guy, go back, like there's just no way to stop all these threats. I think after here, this move is also quite strong, trying to come in here. You just have so many possible threats. And if the king goes here, you have a nice little combination as well. So you're talking about e3 versus f3. Usually you get the pawn here. These two pawns are just so powerful. e3 I think actually does the job, and then it takes here. That's good enough, because you're not going to be able to create a fortress with pawns like this. So for example, let's say you do this and here. You can actually just grab this bishop if you want. Because the fact is that these pawns are not good fortress pawns. A fortress pawn would be like here with a rook here. A pawn up here is almost impossible to create a fortress with. So here you could just slowly connect all the pawns. The fact that you have many pawns is almost irrelevant here. So I'm not saying this is a completely trivial win. Of course, you have to know how to win queen versus rook. You have to know how to collect the pawns. But it's a relatively easy task from here on. You could also play queen check first with the idea that this check is always available if you move the king. So you have to pin yourself. And then e3 is maybe even stronger. You can also just improve a king. You have so many options here. In any case, Anish probably saw this and saw it was bad for him. So he decided to try for a different type of fortress. He took this pawn, which at first just looks like a blunder. You play queen e1 check and you take this bishop. But the fact is, this position is incredibly close to a draw. It isn't, but it's incredibly close. And it's amazing that not only did he aim for this, clearly kind of knowing it wasn't a draw, but that he knew exactly how to play it, and he didn't spoil the draw once. So there's one also very significant piece of endgame knowledge here, which you should know. And by the way, this is extremely close to a draw. When I say extremely, I mean extremely. For example, white can win this last pawn by taking here. And black has only one way to win this position. If the rook is on g3 here, absolutely it would be a draw. Not with the pawn on e4, but we'll get to that later. Queen d5, very good. So the key with this move is there's no king here because of here, so you're forced to move f3. With the pawn on f2 and rook here, it's just a draw. Pawn on f3, rook e4, it looks like a draw, right? You have this, but this is actually a win. But it is not trivial. I almost would have tried this if I were him, because I think that winning this at least takes a fair amount of finesse. So to give you an idea, queen takes, king goes to g1. So if the king tries to go up the board, it actually makes life harder for white. Because all you have to do is kind of get around. So for example, after this, the rook just doesn't have that many moves. And the idea of black here, just to show you, just to illustrate, is you're trying to get behind the king. Once you get behind, now here you actually have to be careful because of these checks. Let me give you a better example. Let's say you play queen d2 first. Rook f4 check, king e5, rook e4 check, king d5. And here, white just struggles for moves. If you go here, I go here. If you play here, I'll just collect the pawn and do it all over again. It doesn't really matter. And after here, the idea is you play queen e2, queen f1, queen g1. And then basically your idea is you basically get the king in front of the pawn, and then white struggles to find moves. And eventually you'll, again, grab this pawn. Eventually this pawn will fall. If the king gets behind, it becomes easy. So this is one of those things. Like if you try this, I just do go here. And again, I'm just going to be able to pick off this pawn, and then I have to win queen versus rook. So this is kind of the idea. However, how do you crack the fortress if I bring my king back? And I was amazed. Like I knew that this was a technical win. But I analyzed this by myself. I analyzed this with Ray Robson. I analyzed it with other people. It was almost impossible to find the winning idea by ourselves. It was really, really difficult. So this position, I'm going to show you the problem, and then I'm going to see if you guys can figure out how to win. So white plays king f1. So one of the things is that if you play here, this is a way to win, because you go here, and now you have issues with this pawn, right? So you can't allow that. The key is that you either have to have a rook here guarding this square, or you have to have a king guarding it. So for example, here, you have to try this. Queen here. Rook g4. So once again, you cannot allow this and this, right? So if you allow this, the king goes here, here, the king goes up, and then queen f1, you go behind again, and once you're behind this pawn, the win becomes easier. But the question is, how do you win in this position? And this is surprisingly difficult. So I'm going to give you guys a crack at it. How do you win this position? Even queen versus rook is not the most trivial thing in the world. But how do you win here? And I'm going to need a line or a particular idea, right? One move is not going to do it. With white to move would be quite helpful, yes. Although even with white to move, I can go here, right? Because my rook covers. So what do you do? But keep in mind, I'm not going to play rook g5 ever. I'm just going to keep my rook here. I'm never playing rook g5. Not on your life. So what are you going to do? And yeah, queen h3, I play king back to f2. Not so easy. Okay, so I'm seeing suggestions like this, but you're kind of assuming your opponent doesn't play chess, right? Like, they're going to stop you. You're not going to be able to do this by force. You can try to check and come around this way, but it's going to be the same thing. I'm going to come here. I'm going to stop you from doing this idea. So how do you win? I think it's just impossible. I mean, it's really hard to find. Ray and I were struggling with this for quite a long time. But imagine if they had played this. I'm curious if Nepo would have easily cracked this or not. I mean, Nepo maybe won. The thing is, I'd say most GMs have the knowledge that the pawn here and rook here is something that should be winning, but to actually do it is really, really difficult. The problem with triangulation here is I can still kind of do this, right? I don't remember how much time, but knowing Nepo, he had lots of time. He always plays super fast, even when the game's crazy. Yeah, this is quite a bit harder than bishop and knight checkmate, that is for sure. Well, king to g6, though, how are you actually doing this? And this pawn is almost irrelevant, honestly. Like, it's not... It doesn't really matter for the position, because if ever h5, you just go and take the pawn, and then you come back. Like, it really just doesn't matter. As far as evaluation of the position goes. All right, first of all, this is not a3. This is h3, guys. But yeah, queen h3, I just come here. You're not really doing anything. So one of the key ideas here, believe it or not, is that this king is actually on a bad square. Let me illustrate what I mean. Let us say I play something like this. Let me see. Let me go. Which one of the lines? I wrote down a few here. Okay, no, this is something else. Nope. Yeah, h5. So let's just say they give away this pawn, and you come back to this position. So to give you an example, right? Let's say they play queen here. This is actually a really good example. So this position looks like a zugzwang, right? And the reason being that if you try rook here, you simply play queen here and go this way. If I play rook g4, yeah, if you play rook g4, you come this way. If you go king back, you go here. And again, you force yourself behind the pawn, which you know is winning. But white has a resource here, which is to play here. which looks crazy, right? But the idea is that if queen g5 check, for instance, and rook king here, you can always give this check. So as long as you hang on to the pawn, you can go back there and then go back. So I can do this, I can give a check here, but believe it or not, you're making no progress. I can always go back. So the winning method here is to give you an idea in this position, right? So in this position, the way you win is you maneuver your king all the way over here, which looks insane, right? But the idea is that you play king c5 and somehow white has no moves. If they come here, you bring the king this way. That's already really bad news. If you go here, I come there. And now if you go here, I simply bring the king up. So the difference is with the king on f5, it looks like a better king, but it's actually worse. Because if you go back, I can't come up. So you actually need the king out of the way so that now the rook has nowhere to go. If here, you go here. And if the king goes back, for example, you give checks, come here, come behind, and then you approach, and now it becomes very trivial. At least relatively, right? So you see how that all worked? So getting behind the pawn is winning. So let me just show you. So once you get behind the pawn, it just becomes impossible to kind of defend. So for example, if I go here, you go here, and there's just, you're going to run out of moves. If you try to move up the board, I go here. And notice how you can't push because I'm just going to check and win your rook. So you have to just give away your pawn. So that's why, and again, you have to still win queen versus rook, of course, which is its own thing. But that's kind of why this is winning. Let's say you give a check, right? I go behind your pawn. And again, you just don't really have a good course of action here. If you push up, I just come behind your pawn, and your pawn can't advance without giving away your rook. So once the queen gets behind, everything just falls apart for white. And that's kind of the key here. Learning to win queen versus rook is not easy, guys. And that's something you got to learn. But I'm not so much illustrating, like, I'm just showing how complex, first of all, endgames can be. Like, this endgame was so complicated. But also the concept of a fortress and how to crack it. So white's idea is basically that I'm moving my rook back and forth. You can't do anything about it. But the fact is, if you can make it so your opponent has no good move, that's how you crack it. So this is an example of one of those positions. You play king c5, a surprising move, and all of a sudden, there's just nothing. If you go up, then you come back, and then all of a sudden your king's stuck again. You're in Zugzwang again. If the king goes back, then you come here. If the rook goes here, you come this way. And somehow, there's just no way, there's just no good move for white. So it's just a really crazy situation. In the game, however, he played rook g5. And now queen a1, queen b1, and he made this look so easy. But the fact is, this position is anything but easy. To give you an example, after move king f1, believe it or not, black has an only move here. At least I'm fairly sure. Yeah. Black only has one move. And the key is you not only have to figure out, no, this is not a draw. This is a win. But only with one move here is black. Every other move draws. So the question is, what is that move for black? So keep in mind, this is another one of those positions where you have an irrelevant pawn. This pawn on h4 is not super relevant. It's actually annoying, but once you, like, this pawn is not going anywhere, right? So the key point is these two pawns and what you have to accomplish. If you play queen c4 check, for example, I play king here, and how do you win? My plan is to do this until the end of time. How do you win? And this is the key to discovering a fortress. You ask yourself, do I have a winning plan? Believe it or not, the answer there is no. You can even take away this pawn. It doesn't matter. How do you win? You need to provoke f3, but how do you stop? I'm just going to move my rook back and forth. Now, you can try something like this, right? Say I go here, and then you go here. You're like twiddling your thumbs, like I'm not trying to do anything. Pretend this pawn's off the board. This pawn's not relevant. Now you're threatening to take the rook. Again, pretending this pawn is off the board. But I'm gonna go here. I'm not gonna let you take that rook. Oh, sorry. This is actually a bad move. Again, pretend. I'm just gonna make this easier for you guys. We're gonna do this. I'm gonna go and take this pawn just for fun. And now we're gonna come back, and I'm gonna come here. So this is an important position. This move actually does lose. I just want to make it easier for you guys by eliminating that guy. So this move does lose. How does this move lose? Didn't mean to confuse you guys, but again, these positions are complicated. Like, I have to make sure I know all the ins and outs myself, right? Queen takes e3. Know your king and pawn endgames, right? I move over here, and this is a known win because even though you get opposition, I'm on the 6th rank, or the 3rd in this case, so it doesn't matter. I just move to the side, and this is a fairly simple win. However, what happens if I go here? How do you win? You can wait for my rook, but I just go back and forth. I just wait. If you ever try here, I can just take it. That's no problem. If the queen ever goes here, I can also take it and come up this way, almost always. You'd love to trade the pawns, right? But you can't. Every time you push, I just take. So believe it or not, with the king here, this is a draw. So in this position, after king f1, the only move is queen d2. So this is something that seems like computerish. It seems impossible. But the only way you can figure stuff like this out is if you figure out the concept. You have to figure out what is the idea. And the fact is that with the king on e1 and rook on e3, you cannot win this position. Once you realize that, once you understand that concept, play becomes easier because you have a purpose. You're not just randomly moving your queen around. You're trying to do it with a very specific purpose. And once the queen keeps the king cut off, you can win. But even here, it takes a bit of delicacy. For example, after rook h3, this happened in the game, queen d5. Notice how he keeps the king cut off. He says, no. Queen check. Queen h5. Again, not allowing a win. If king f1, you have queen d1 check. He's making sure that the king never gets to e1. So rook a3 was played. Queen d5. Again, no. King f6. And here they fiddled around a little bit. So he lost the tempo, brought his king back. And this was actually really cool. He just brings his king to f6. And here it's almost a mini zugzwang because the rook can't move. If the rook moves to the side, then you play like this and are able to take the pawn. Because the pawn's not irrelevant in that, like, you still have to take the thing. The only annoying thing about this pawn is you have to take the thing without allowing the king over here. That's kind of the crucial thing, right? So you want to actually take that pawn with the king. So if the rook moves up here, then you can start doing moves like queen f3 and e3 and you just end the game. If you go here, of course, then this move, right? So you must move the rook and then the king comes over. And now you just run out of moves. Takes. Brings the king over. The question is, what is the final winning idea? I still have this. Why is the king on g2 so important? And this is my final question for you guys. Why is that king so important here? If the king were here, the queen were here, this is a draw. You guys know this now. Why is it so important that the king is on g2? Very nice. And this, fittingly, was the move he resigned. Because now you're threatening to take. If they take the queen, you take with the pawn, of course. King f1, king c3. Threatening this. If king here, king here. So the queen can't be captured, but it's not just a fancy move. Like, what if I play a move like this? What is my plan after rook g3? Because keep in mind, if you take the rook and I take back, you're not doing anything. But what is your plan? Queen here serves a very specific purpose. But how do you trade pawns? If here I take, right? If here I take here, you're not winning anything. Fancy moves are fun, but how did you break the fortress? Why did he resign? Why is rook g3 not a move? Queen e2 is possible. Queen e2 might actually do the trick. But after queen e2, you still need work to do, right? I still go here. Life still continues, right? What is your plan? And this is what you have to ask yourself when cracking fortresses. You need a plan. Your plan is to get the king past this barrier. The reason why you can't win is because the king is on this barrier that the king cannot cross. You cross the barrier. Now, this is always a thing. So let's say white just keeps the rook here, right? Now you come closer. You have to be careful this doesn't work, by the way, guys. But you're too fast, of course. And next you're going to come here. And now the win is easy. Just please do not fall for this. That's the only thing I beg of you. And now you have to lose. Don't do it this way. But of course you can just take the rook. That's the end. Or you could do it any number of ways. You just control this square. Try to come here. I mean, now it's actually very easy to win. This pawn is just too much of a weakness, right? But notice how the whole purpose of all this maneuvering and keeping the king out of here. Because notice, if you have the king here, queen here, you can just take it. Because the king can blockade your pawn. So the whole purpose of this was to that you create a blockade of this barrier that the king can then cross. And that's the whole purpose of this hell endgame. And that's what Nepo did. That's why he had to keep the king out of e1. That's why he had to maneuver the king over here to take this pawn slowly and then come back. And he did all this perfectly with no issues at all. So it's really, really a cool thing that he was able to do this and that he was able to accomplish this without ever blowing the win. So just overall, really, really cool. Thanks, Davina. I'm glad you guys liked it. In any case, I hope you guys enjoyed the lecture. Again, it was a really complicated game, really complex, but I hope you guys at least got something from it. And stay tuned. I don't know if there's anything coming next today, but definitely I'll be at the club doing Twitch streams, more lectures, stuff like that. Yeah, Nepo's pretty awesome. Anyway, guys, I'm glad you enjoyed it, and I will see you next time.